If you notice there on your outline for Sunday evening, we are beginning a 5-part sermon series, our fall sermon series, and we're doing it on monsters. And what does that mean? We're going to get into that this evening and kind of set the tone for the next several weeks. If you notice there in your outline, we're going to be talking tonight about our struggle with the monster of sin. We're going to be talking about the horror of hidden monsters. What about those things that lurk in the shadows and cause us difficulties? We're going to talk about when monsters gather. What about evil company? What about those who gather around us who don't have any good intentions for our life? How do we handle that? We're going to be talking about seeing the monster and others. Sometimes it's easier to look at an individual and see they're wrong and what they're not doing right. And we forget that in seeing the monster in others, we sometimes forget the monster that's in us. Then we will finish things with a look at the great monster killer. That's Jesus Christ, the one who has taken care of our sin. So I hope you'll be here each night or each Sunday evening for this series. SeaWorld, it's not as popular as it is today as it once was, but SeaWorld had a big attraction, and it was a whale called Shamu. And people would go, and it was a big attraction for families. They would go, and they would see this killer whale jumping around the pool. They would see him doing essentially tricks, going here and there. There'd be a trainer with him, and the trainer would ride on the back of Shamu, and they would twirl him around on his, the trainer would be twirled around on his nose. I mean, all these different things. And the crowd would cheer, and they would just go crazy. I mean, look what's happening. Until one day, Shamu killed its trainer during the middle of a show. And people at that moment began to realize that they forgot something very important about this well. It's a killer. You don't tame that. It's a killer. You don't take that instinct out of this well. You're not able to train it to the point where it puts away that instinct to say that I want to hunt prey, that I want to kill those things that I come in contact with. They'd forgotten it. And it led to the death of a trainer. Brethren, can I suggest to you that sin is often seen by us the same way? We forget that it's a killer. We forget that sin has a monstrous effect on our life. And if we're not careful, we begin to see it as something that's tame. Oh, I know this is wrong. I know I shouldn't be doing this. But it's really no big deal, you see. Oh, I understand that there's other people and you know, they've had struggles with whatever that thing may be. They've had struggles with it, but I'm going to be okay. And they forget that sin is a killer. Now, when I talk about monsters tonight, I'm not talking about something that's hiding under your bed. That's for children. I'm not talking about something that might be in your closet. That's for children. I'm not talking about some noise or bump you might hear in the attic or something that you might hear down in the basement. Those are tales for kids. I'm talking about something that seeks you out. I'm talking about something that regardless of how we want to pacify it or we think we can control it, we're talking about something that has a monstrous effect in our life, death. When God is dealing in Genesis chapter 4 and verse 7 with Cain, he says these words to Cain. He says, sin is crouching at your door. It's ready for you, Cain. It's waiting for you. It's crouching there. It's ready to pounce. It's ready to do what it does best, to destroy. That's the monster we're talking about. That's the monster that we all struggle with. Go over to Romans chapter 3, beginning in verse 9, and see this commonality that we share with this monster. It says, what then, are we better than they? Paul says, not at all. He says, for we have previously charged both Jews and Greeks. He's talking about everybody. It doesn't leave anybody out. The world's divided between Jews and Gentiles, Jews and Greeks. Oh, you've got barbarians, you've got Scythians, you've got these fringes out there on the border of society, but it's just two groups of people, Jews and Gentiles. And he says that both are under sin, that everybody has sinned. He says, as it is written, there is none righteous, no, not one. There is none who understands. There is none who seeks after God. They have all turned aside. They have together become unprofitable. There is no one who does good. No, not one. Well, maybe the monster won't get me. No, not one. Well, maybe I can hide from the monster of sin. No, not one. Maybe I'll escape. Maybe I'll get by. Maybe I'll be able to do something where it won't get me. No, not one. I think one of the things that we have to remember more and more as society begins to go down this path where more and more things that were once clearly defined as being ungodly are finding acceptance now in our society. Well, societies all around the world. I think one of the things that we have to be mindful of is how sin takes hold of the lives of individuals and destroys them. Destroys them. Another thing that I'll remind you of, over in Romans chapter 7, you're in Romans 3, go over to Romans chapter 7, and I want to remind you of something that the Apostle Paul says. Paul gives us a glimpse into his life, and this is the struggle that we all have, and Paul lays himself out there. And Paul, as he writes to the church in Rome, says, let me use myself as an example. And he's talking about a monster. He's talking about sin. And Paul says these words. He says, for what I am doing, I do not understand. For what I will to do, that I do not practice, but what I hate, that I do. He says, if then I do what I will not to do, I agree I agree with the law that it is good. But now it is no longer I who do it, but sin that dwells in me. For I know that in me, that is in my flesh, nothing good dwells. For to will is present with me, but how to perform what is good I do not find. And summing up where he's at in his life, from his perspective, he says in verse 19, for the good that I will to do, I do not do. But the evil that I will not to do, that I practice. Now, if I do what I will not to do, it is no longer I who do it, but sin that dwells in me. It's a monster. It's a struggle. And Paul lays that out for us, and I break it down for you there on your outline. If you notice, Paul says, what I hate to do, that's what I do. There's where the struggle is. The good that I want to do, I don't do. There's where the struggle is. Oh, wretched man that I am. He's talking about himself. He's given an honest appraisal, not what somebody thinks about him, not what others are saying about him, but where Paul sees himself. Oh, wretched man that I am, struggle. Struggle with the monster of sin. We have many examples in the Bible. I give you several there on your outline of people who have lost the struggle with sin. The monster overtook them. It brought destruction in its wake. And you see it in the life of Judas in Luke 22 and verse 48, where he betrays Jesus with a kiss. You see it in the actions of Ananias and Sapphira, where they lie, Acts chapter 5, verses 1 through 11, and the consequences are their death. You see it in Demas in 2 Timothy 4 and verse 10, who used to be a helper to Paul, who was there in the preaching of the gospel, but then deserts him and goes back to the world. And you see it in 1 Timothy 4 and verse 1 with those who have fallen away into sin, and those who will one day embrace error. The monster of sin got its way. And the end result wasn't just a bad day. The end result wasn't just a little bit of trouble, some struggles that had to be overcome. The end result was catastrophic. It was losing to the monster. One of the things, and we're going to touch on this from time to time as we work our way through this sermon series, is we have to remember that sin, and this is how I phrase it on your outline. You may not think about it this way, but sin, if you will, has an ambassador. That sin has one who stands out there as a figurehead, that it has one who is saying, it's okay, do these things that aren't right, live in these ways that aren't ungodly. It has an ambassador who will say, listen, you don't have to let somebody tell you what to do, let alone God. You don't have to conform yourself to a set standard of things that are right or wrong. You live how you want to live, and you do what you want to do, and you like what you want to like. And that ambassador is Satan. Peter talks about it in 1 Peter chapter 5, beginning there in verse 8, where he says, be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary, the devil, walks about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. Resist him, steadfast in the faith, knowing that the same sufferings are experienced by your brotherhood in the world. You don't think for one moment that you're the only person dealing with this monster, do you? You're not under some type of illusion that you're all alone out there in the world, that it's just you that's in this spiritual battle, that everybody else has it okay, that everybody else is doing right, that it's just you and Paul. Oh, wretched man that I am. It's just us that is struggling. It's all of us. It's all of us. How does sin work in our life? How does this monster get a foothold? Well, there's several different ways. In Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 14, we learn that sin comes through deceit, that it gives birth to those things that are wrong. It says this in verse 14, that we should no longer be children, tossed to and fro, and carried about with every wind of doctrine by the trickery of men and the cunning craftiness of deceitful plotting. Now, I like how it continues, but speaking the truth in love, I love that, but we're not dealing with verse 15. We're dealing with verse 14. We're not dealing with the wonderful things that come about from speaking the truth of love in verse 15. We're dealing with the fact that there's this deceitful plotting. We're dealing in verse 14 with these these carried about by this wind of doctrine, by the trickery of men. That's what we're dealing with. Deceit works in our life to pull us away from God, never closer. Deceit is the opposite of honesty. God works in honesty. God calls us to work through honesty. Deceit is a product of sin. We see this monster enticing us through things like temptations. Go over in your Bible to James chapter 1. James chapter 1 and beginning in verse 13. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am tempted by God. That's a statement, by the way. That's something that's being said in an emphatic way. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he himself tempt anyone. Now here's the responsibility, verse 14. But each one is tempted when he is drawn away by his own desires and enticed. The devil made me do it. My friend made me do it. He made me do it. She made me do it. They made me do it. Anything to avoid any type of personal responsibility. But it was my desires. It was me being enticed. It was me making a decision. I have to own up to that. Then when desire is conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, brings forth joy? No. Brings forth hope? No. Brings forth death. For the wages of sin, Romans 6 and 23, for the wages of sin isn't just a bad day. For the wages of sin is death. that comes through these means of temptations that come into our life. How about these words? Turn over, if you will, to 1 John. 1 John, and beginning in chapter 2, notice what it says beginning in verse 15. And here you see that this monster of sin entices through lust. It says, do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, I'm going to give us three things. The lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life is not of the Father, but is of the world. And what does he say of the world? And the world is passing away, and the lust of it, but he who does the will of God abides forever. It's a choice. Do you want to live, or do you want to die? Do you want to have the blessings and the peace that come through a relationship with God, or do you want to yoke yourself to that sin, whatever it may be, that's only going to cause you heartache, regardless of what you think, regardless of what you do? Sin seeks to entice us. This monster wants to get its hands around us. In Hebrews chapter 5, beginning there in verse 12, we see one of the most effective ways that sin can work, and that's by a lack of spiritual growth. How can I cause Christians to struggle? Don't let them study. How can the church be harmed? Don't let them study. How can somebody doubt the place and the relationship that they have with God? Don't let them study. Paul says, the author of Hebrews says, for though by this time you ought to be teachers, you need someone to teach you again the first principles of the oracles of God, and you have come to need milk and not solid food. You haven't grown. You haven't grown. He says, for everyone who partakes only of milk is unskilled in the word of righteousness, for he is a babe. But solid food belongs to those who are of full age, that is, those who by reason of use have their senses exercised to discern both good and evil. Do you see that? They can discern the difference between good and evil. How? By understanding, by knowledge, by growing in your understanding of the Word of God. It's nothing. It is, you wouldn't blink an eye to see a baby drinking a bottle of milk. You probably even wouldn't stop and look at it. But it would catch your attention if you saw a 58-year-old man drinking a bottle of milk. And something in you would say, that's not right. Well, it's not right for us as Christians either to reach the point where we need to be mature, but we're still on the bottle. Where we need to be able to discern, the last sentence there, to discern both good and evil, but we can't discern good from evil. We can't make a decision and see which one is right and which one is wrong because we haven't grown spiritually. You don't think that's going to have consequences not only in our life, but in the life of the church? This is a monster. And then how about those words over in 2 Timothy chapter 4, where we learn that the monster of sin entices through the accepting of false doctrine. And Paul writes these words, for the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine, but according to their own desires, because they have itching ears, they will heap up for themselves teachers. And they will turn their ears away from the truth and be turned aside to fables. But you, be watchful in all things, Timothy. Endure afflictions, Timothy. Do the work of an evangelist, Timothy. Fulfill your ministry. That's wonderful advice, not just to a young man who's beginning his preaching career. That's wonderful advice to you and I. Do we fulfill our ministry? Do we set out to do those things that are going to be good and godly and beneficial? Or are we hanging around with those who are the false teachers? Those who are saying the things, not that we need to hear, they're saying the things that we want to hear because they sound pleasing to us. What would you rather hear? The ice cream truck is here, or I need you to dig a ditch 15 feet deep. Which one do you want to hear? A lot of false doctrine is that way. It's ice cream. And it sounds good. But the work that truly needs to be done is digging that ditch and putting ourselves to the task or the cause that's ahead of us. That's how the monster entices. It has to have a hook. It has to have a way to pull us in. It has to have something that we look at and we say, well, I kind of like that. This is a smart monster. I kind of find that, I don't know, appealing. Whatever that sin may be. I find it attractive, desirous. I think it's going to benefit me in some way. I think it's going to give me something that maybe I'm lacking, that I've always wanted. It's going to give me a leg up. It's going to help me to finally come in first. Whatever it may be, sin presents itself in this way in which it is enticing. Reach for it. Long for it. Want it. Desire it. It's enticing. That's a monster. That's a monster. Well, Brother Donald, it seems like there's no hope in what you're saying. I mean, I'll agree with you. If you look at the first part of your outline there, things don't look very good. Things look pretty dim if you look at that, but all hope isn't lost. While this is a ravenous monster, while this is a monster that seeks to cause us harm and pain and never wants to deliver anything good, while the monster of sin only wants to destroy, all hope isn't lost. It's not. Let me give you some suggestions real quick for how we can fight against the monster of sin. And you see this, how do you describe it? You see this plot. When you watch a horror movie, you always see the same plot. Oh, there's always a monster or something that's always there. But you see the reaction is always the same. When confronted with the monster, what do the people do? Well, they run. Nobody gets the thought in their head, well, here I stand. I'm going to fight. I'm going down in a blaze of glory. They run. They're encountered with the monster. They're terrified of the monster. And they do the first thing that comes. I need to put distance between me and it. And they run. Well, I'm going to suggest something to you. That when we deal with the monster of sin, and when it comes to fighting against it, now, hold on, let me explain it. We also need to run. We also need to run, but not in the same way. We need to live in such a way that the monster of sin faces defeat. Let me give you some of these suggestions. Here's the first one. We need to run understanding with the prize in our mind. Go over to 1 Corinthians chapter 9. This is the Apostle Paul that's talking. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, beginning there in verse 24. And Paul says these words. He says, "Do you not know that those who run in a race all run, but one receives the prize? Run in such a way that you may obtain it." He says, "And everyone who competes for the prize is temperate in all things. Now they do it to obtain a perishable crown, but we for an imperishable crown." I'm in it to win it. And you've heard me say this before, and you can check it. You can look into it. Put me to the test. You've heard me say this. There, in the history of athletics, there has never been not one single... Now, you Google this and you test me. In the history of athletics, there has never been a person who's ever won a race who didn't take the first step. You got to run if you want the prize. You got to put in the effort if you want the prize. The monster of sin wants us to forget our goal. Why am I running? What am I running for? The monster of sin wants to dilute the things that we know and understand in the world so that we'll be a people who have that finish line kind of foggy in our mind. Not something that is sharp and crisp, not something that beckons us to come. We have to be a people who understand that we need to run with the understanding that I want to win. That's the prize. The prize goes to the winner. Here's the second thing. Stay there in 1 Corinthians 9. We need to be a people who run with purpose and direction. Paul says, therefore I run thus, not with uncertainty. That's going to be a key. Think about that. Not with uncertainty. Thus I fight, not as one who beats the air, but I discipline my body and I bring it into subjection, lest when I have preached to others, I myself should become disqualified. I put in the effort. I understand that I need to run in a certain way, not with uncertainty, that I run with purpose, that I run with a goal in mind, with a direction in mind. I mentioned on your outline that the monster of sin wants you to forget your way. Where am I going? Which direction do I need to go? It wants to do all that it can to confuse you, to harm you, to disorient you. But that's not what we're called to do. We're called to run with the understanding that we have a purpose, that we have a direction that is before us, and to the best of our ability, we hold to it. We're dealing with the monster of sin. We're dealing with those things that want to tear us down and destroy us and break our relationship, not only with one another, but with God. We got to run, brethren. Here's the third thing. How can we fight against the monster of sin? We need to run with endurance. You don't think it's tiring? You don't think a race wears you out? You don't think having to make good and godly decisions day in and day out, week after week and month after month, you don't think that makes you weary? You don't think having to say to those around you, I'm sorry, but I can't participate in that? Or listen, I know that that's not good for me, that I have to abstain from that, I have to hold back. You don't think those things make us weary? Well, they do. But when it comes to fighting against the monster of sin, we endure. Listen to these words again in 1 Corinthians. Go over to chapter 15 and go down to the last verse, verse 58. And Paul says, therefore, my beloved brethren, I love the side note here. I love the way he phrases that there. I like the way Paul addresses the brethren. My beloved brethren, I love you. I love you. Therefore, my beloved brethren, be steadfast. This is Paul's advice to them. Immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that your labor is not in vain in the Lord. When we run according to what God is pleased with in the Lord, when we do those things that are good and godly in the Lord, when we live in such a way that we bring honor to God in the Lord, when we do those things that are going to strengthen our relationship with God in the Lord, when we do those things where we can say, thus saith the Lord in the Lord, then we're going to be individuals who are going to endure. We're going to be individuals who are going to be steadfast. We're going to be individuals who don't grow weary. I'll hang in there. Why? Because God gives me that endurance. And what is being asked of me is to be steadfast in it, to be immovable. I won't be pushed around. I won't go in a direction that I shouldn't go. The understanding that we always need to be abounding. How can you abound by standing in one place? We understand that in this fight against the monster of sin, we can't grow weary. Here's another thing. In fighting against the monster of sin, we need to run with the pattern in mind. I want you to think about that as a game plan. Go over to 2 Timothy chapter 1. 2 Timothy chapter 1, beginning there in verse 13. And Paul says, hold fast the pattern of sound words which you have heard from me in faith and love, which are in Christ Jesus. Well, now, I think there are two things that clearly jump off the page there to us. The first thing is what we're told to do right off the beginning. Hold fast. Don't quit. Don't give up. Don't turn around. Hold fast. To what? What's the point of saying, hang in there, if I don't know what I'm hanging in there with? What's the point of saying, I got a grip on it and I'm not going to let go, if we don't know what we have a grip on? He says, hold fast the pattern of sound words. A tupos. A pattern. Something that you can follow. Something that's laid out for you. Listen, in Christianity, you're not reinventing the wheel. In Christianity, you don't have to look at life and say, I have no idea whatsoever how I should live and what I should do and what is right or what is wrong or what is good or what is God. I have no idea. You have a pattern. You follow the pattern. You have a way that is set out for you. You follow that way. It's your game plan. The pattern, it's your game plan. As long as I stick to it, everything will be okay. I think it was Mike Tyson, maybe Muhammad Ali. I think it was Mike Tyson who said everybody has a game plan till they get punched in the face. It's true. You need to be prepared for the brutality of life. You don't want to deviate from that game plan. You want to say, I'm holding to this pattern. Nothing is going to get me off of it. I know it's a monster. I know I'm in a terrifying situation. I know that I don't want to be here. I know that I wouldn't rather be wrestling with this thing, whatever it is. You fill in the blank. But if I stick to the plan, I'll be okay. Then I'll give you one more. How to fight against the monster of sin? We need to run with the understanding that forgiveness needs to be a factor in our life. What do I mean by that? Go over to Ephesians chapter 1. Ephesians chapter 1 in verse 7. If I were to say to you, if I were to say to you, hey, I want you to think about one terrible mistake that you made in your life. Well, I've made several, but if I said to you, think about one terrible mistake that you made in your life, I don't think any of us would have to step back and say, well, I mean, I just, terrible mistake. I mean, I really can't, let me think, I can't, you'd know immediately. I sure wish I hadn't done that. I sure wish I hadn't gotten involved with that individual. I sure wish I would have avoided that situation years ago, because now look at the problem that it's causing in my life. You wouldn't have to spend a lot of time trying to think about something. You know it. One of the biggest problems that we have, and one of the greatest schemes of the monster of sin, is to make you forget that you are a person who lives in a world where forgiveness from God is possible. Possible. You know what one of the biggest struggles is that Christians say they have when it comes to prayer? One of the biggest struggles they have is they say that when I go into prayer with God, I keep bringing up all these things that I've already asked Him to forgive me for. You see, I can't forget. Even though I've already laid it before God and I've put my soul bare before Him, even though I've asked Him to forgive me, even though I've put distance between myself and that sin, even though I've made the effort, it just keeps coming back and back and back. That's an issue of understanding forgiveness. Forgiveness needs to be a factor, because don't you think for one moment that monster of sin isn't going to bring up your past. It says in Him, that's Christ, verse 7, In him we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of sins according to the riches of his grace. I don't know what you're going to remember about tonight's lesson. I mean, you've got an outline. Maybe you'll look over it and different things will come to your mind. I don't know, but there's one thing that I hope you take with you when you walk out that door, and it's the understanding that God forgives. God forgives. And when you're dealing with a monster that wants to terrorize you, understanding forgiveness really makes a difference. When you're dealing with a monster who keeps saying, but do you remember when? Do you remember how? Do you remember that time? Do you remember that day? When you're dealing with a monster that wants to keep bringing those things to you, you have to remember, you have to run with the understanding that God forgives. In him we have redemption through his blood, Christ. The forgiveness of sins. It was a Psychology Today poll, and this is years. I've made mention to this. We're talking years ago, 15 years ago. We're talking years ago. There was a Psychology Today poll where they were polling different psychiatrists about how they help patients, and one of the psychiatrists said, "I could close my practice down if I could just get people to forgive themselves." Now, I'm not saying justify a wrong. I'm not saying that there's not consequences in an individual's life that carry on because they're dealing with unconfessed sin, unresolved sin, unrepented of sin. I'm not saying that, but I am saying when we go before the mercy seat of God, when we as Christians go before him and we plead with him for that forgiveness that comes through the blood of Jesus Christ, that God is a God who says to us as individuals, forgiveness is a factor in your life. And we need to do all that we can to never forget what the blood of Christ has done. Monsters have fears too, you know. There's things that worry monsters as well. I don't think there's any greater fear in sin than that of the blood of Christ. Listen, I know it sounds a little odd. I know you've probably been looking at the sermon titles for a couple weeks now, and I know it looks a little odd, but listen to me. Just hear me out. Monsters are real. They're real. And we as a people of faith need to be prepared to stand against the monster of sin, because if he's not here now, he's coming. If you haven't had to battle him before, a battle is coming. But we can win. Where are you in your battle? Where are you in dealing with your monster? Let me extend to you this evening the invitation. If you are here tonight and we can do something to encourage you, we would like to do that, to help you, to support you in any way. Would you let us know how we can do that? Are you here and you need more study? We'd love to study with you. I'd love to visit with you and help you. If you're not comfortable coming forward, there's a suggestion box back there. You can drop a suggestion in the box and say, hey, here's a situation. What do you think about this? I want to help you any way that we possibly can. The best way that we can help is if there's anybody here who's not a New Testament Christian. Oh, friend, you need to be. To hear, believe, repent, confess, and to be baptized. And finally begin to find victory over that monster of sin. How can we help you? If we can, you come forward as we stand and sing.